Cool. So I'm going to start and I'll let people still join. Happy New Year, everyone. Welcome back to another London Power BI user group, another virtual one. We actually really thought in December we could have a in-person session. And we actually scheduled everything happened, and we had to cancel it because of the new wave and all the stuff around it. That's why we moved the session into January. And here we have Mathias. I hope I'm saying your name right.
Mathias.
Mathias, okay. Yeah. So yeah, that's why we're here with the same session again in January. Hopefully very soon we're going to have in-person session because things looking better, restrictions are going down. We were people who already heard me talking about it. We are hoping to have an in-person session in March, but whenever we're going to have the in-person session, based on the venue, if the venue supports, we will be hosting a online version as well, just so that we could have in-person and the online, because we don't want to miss this kind of having all the international audience. So yeah, that's going to be that. We haven't decided the next event yet, but I am in the conversations, and we will announce it very soon. So today we have Mathias talking about DevOps and how to do DevOps for the Power BI reports. I've heard about this session before, and I'm really excited to learn about it. I know this is one of the painful things for many enterprise level Power BI projects. So before we jump into Mathias' session, we record this session. We are recording this session. So if you don't, I would ask you to please mute yourself if you're not a speaker or me, and please turn off your camera as well, just so that I mean, you don't have to turn off immediately, but like in a bit, because that would make our editing process very easy. Actually, this is something I wanted to say first, which I haven't said. So I am Prati Kamasani, as you could probably see here, and I run this user group along with James Dales, who has not been well to attend this session today. So he's the one who will be doing all the editing, and it will make his life a lot easy if we don't mute, if we mute ourselves and don't show our cameras. If you have any questions today during the session, please use the chat window. If you don't have access to the chat window, if you don't see it, please raise your hand, and when Mathias is happy to take the questions, we will unmute you, or we will ask you to unmute, and that's how we will do it. And when you're asking the questions in the chat, if you could just use the queue in front of it, so that will give us a quick way to scroll through the questions to see what is there, and just to make sure we don't miss anything. And I think that's it. That's pretty much for today. I'm really excited to have you all back here and having another session. So that's it from me. And I think if you haven't, this is the time to stop your camera. And I will see you. I will hand it over to you, Mathias.
Okay, fantastic.
Yeah.
Also, Happy New Year to everyone from me. Thank you very much, Prati and James, for giving me this opportunity. It's a huge honor. I've been a member of this group for years now. I've always wanted to have this opportunity to speak. Didn't think it would happen remotely, but here we are. So yeah, thanks very much for that. Let me start sharing my screen, introducing myself, and then telling you what I want to talk about. Here we go. You should see my screen now. So DevOps for Power BI reports. Who am I? Mathias Thierbach. I'm head of finance systems at YouGov, which includes analytics via Power BI, but also ERP and data governance. I've worked on Microsoft technologies for over 17 years now, in different roles, most of them quite technical. Been a software engineer, software architect, for many years. Now I'm leading a data management team. I moved into Microsoft BI around 2015 and started off with analysis services Tabular and then moved on to Power BI around 16, 17. When I'm not running finance systems at YouGov, one of my huge passions is pbi-tools, which is an open source tool which will actually feature quite a bit today. Started work on that 5 years ago, or almost 5 years ago now, and open sourced it just in October, so just a few months ago. There's some contacts here. Follow me on Twitter, LinkedIn. Yeah, so that's enough about myself. In terms of agenda, just so you know what to expect. First of all, what is Power BI DevOps? Let's look into that a little bit and figure out what business and functional requirements would we actually define upfront in order to implement a DevOps solution. I'm going to talk about some assumptions I'm making here just to set expectations and so that everyone understands what I'm covering, what I'm not covering. Going to explain the setup we've got, and then we're going to go into demo mode. I don't want to bore people with too many slides for too long, so I want to do a first demo relatively early, and then step back and talk about the background a little bit. Looking into environments, repositories, branching, and then basically do some more in-depth demos. So that's the plan. Let's get started. Power BI DevOps. It's definitely a buzzword nowadays, and I hope it's more than that. One point I really want to bring home is that it's not a tool and not a technology. DevOps really is more about culture. From my point of view, it's more about people, processes, and practices than tools and technologies. And one way of looking at this, which is quite established and common now, is the CAMS model, which was coined by Edwards and Willis, where they say the 4 pillars of DevOps are culture, automation, measurement, and sharing. If you pop CAMS model and DevOps into Google, you'll see hundreds of thousands of hits there. So that should give some good background reading. Specifically in Power BI, it's quite interesting from my point of view because we, as a community, we don't really have a very mature DevOps foundation right now. There are lots of anti-patterns around. People deploying straight into production. Obviously, Power BI Desktop Publish makes that extremely easy. Many versions of PBIX files around where you don't know, do I have the latest version? Is the version that's in my team folder the one that's actually in the Power BI workspace, or has someone published a private update that no one else has seen? How do I collaborate on Power BI projects as a team when the entire project effectively sits in one single file? And also, in terms of actually managing what my end users see, how do I know what's changed between versions, right? So again, I started saying that I'm running a data management team. Those are real world, day-to-day problems I've got. And so some solutions to those problems are using source control. Most importantly, obviously, a central source control solution, automating deployments, and actually thinking about different environments where we've got workflows in place determining what goes from one environment into another, which is oftentimes also linked to a branching model in source control. So putting a business hat on and trying to look at it from that perspective, I would say our production environment has to be guarded in the sense that we need to have visibility and control in terms of what's in production, what goes into production. But also, everyone needs to have access to all versions of a particular Power BI project or Power BI report. We need to know what's changed between versions. I mentioned it already. And this point is also really important to me. Developers need to be able to get quick feedback from the system, which is potentially in conflict with the first point I've made around actually guarding our production. So obviously, controls are limiting, controls prevent agility. We want to make sure that as part of a DevOps solution, that doesn't happen. We still get the controls, but at the same time, people get quick feedback. How would we implement that? And this is effectively what I'm going to show in the demos coming up. Our code repository has to be the source of truth. What's in a particular repo, in a particular branch, by definition, should be production, for instance, not the other way around. Developers shouldn't have a direct Power BI publish access, certainly not into production. That's something which should come from a machine, from an automated system. I already mentioned approval workflows, and we should also be able to actually trigger deployments for dev and test purposes from a dedicated branch, which is basically the quick feedback point. Assumptions. What can you expect here? So the talk is about what we call thin reports only. Basically, reports connected to a shared data set. That's a very common, well understood pattern. Would be a different talk discussing this. So I'm basically assuming we already have a data set in place. How it got there and how that's being managed is a different talk. I'm going to be using Azure DevOps as the source control solution with source tree as well as VS Code as a Git client. We're also going to be using Git LFS. I'll mention what that is in a bit. I mentioned PBI-tools earlier. We're using that for two purposes here. First of all, PBIX source control. Secondly, deployment orchestration. And then we're using Azure pipelines. So that's part of Azure DevOps as our CI/CD server. Specifically, I'm using XAML pipeline definition files. There are two completely different ways of defining pipelines in Azure. The classic one, which is which has a nice UI, but is very manual. And then there's a modern one, which is file driven. So what's our setup? I've got a demo tenant. I already mentioned there's a shared data set in here. I just basically stole one from SQLBI.com. It's a Contoso data set with calculation groups. It doesn't matter at all. We just need some data to connect to. And then I've created a bunch of workspaces. We're going to see those in a bit. There's a ad hoc reports workspace. And then I've got three groups of workspaces where there are basically three different versions of it corresponding to different environments. I've got a service principal in place. which is set up as a workspace admin for all of those workspaces. And that service principal is what we're using for deployment purposes. All projects with all the details around them are actually available on a public Azure DevOps project, which is available under this URL. There are 5 repos in there. Each one of them has the Azure Pipelines YAML file, I'm using the latest Windows VM image in there to get .NET 6 support, which is what pbi-tools needs. And I also created a variable group which is shared across all of those pipelines to contain the service principal secret. So let me show you what that looks like in practice. So I've just switched over to this sample Azure DevOps project. If we go to repos, we can see there are 5. 4 of them are actually relevant for this. The 5th one basically just contains the latest version of pbi-tools, which where I'm using a private build that isn't public yet. Each of those 4 workspaces then has a corresponding deployment pipeline set up, which I can see here. There we go. Multi-workspace, single workspace, PBIX, simple LFS. I'll explain what that is in a bit. We can see lots of green here. That's always good. And then my Power BI tenant, as I mentioned before, there are quite a few workspaces here, but cool. So I talked about the setup here. So let me show you which we're using as our example here. Right. So I'm looking at a report here, which I've got on my local machine. Obviously, the same report also sits in here. Report 1. Again, nothing particular about this, literally what I've downloaded from SQL BI. Now, let me make a change to this. And let's just do something which will be nicely visible. Here we go. Right. So obviously, this is a bit silly, but at least it'll be very nicely visible for us. So if I save that and go into my project, that's the simple LFS project, I can see this particular report is currently showing as having been modified. I'm going to commit that change, changed background color. Here we go. Commit. And I'm going to push it, which goes straight into that Azure DevOps project. We can see that here, if I refresh pipelines, there we go. So simple LFS is the repo I pushed into. There's a corresponding pipeline for that. And what's now happening is that the updated report got here, and we're now kicking off a deployment into that ad hoc workspace. This is by far the most simple setup you can imagine. There's nothing with branches, no different environments here, literally just a repository of PBIX files, which ultimately end up in my Power BI tenant. So that should have happened now. If I refresh this one here, I can see, there we go. I've got my blue background color. So that is entry level, if you will, super simple. We haven't quite achieved everything we wanted to achieve in terms of a DevOps solution, but we can definitely tick a few boxes here in terms of the deployment is automated. I don't even need to give publish permissions to all developers. And I've got the files which are in my tenant in a central location. Everyone's got access to them. And I always know which particular file is actually the one I'm looking at in my Power BI workspace. So that is one example. If we're looking into another example on the opposite end of the scale, I'm going to open the folder single workspace, that one. So this one is a lot more sophisticated. It uses a branching approach. We can see down here, I'm on the dev branch currently. That one is mapped to a specific environment, which itself is mapped to a Power BI workspace, the dev workspace in that case. And also, you can see that the PBIX files for my report are actually grayed out. Hence, they're not in source control. What I have in source control instead is what pbi-tools gives me, basically a project view, a source file view of my reports, which are the ones that end up in Azure DevOps, and which then ultimately trigger the deployment. So I'm going to show you how that works by doing something very interesting now. Basically, I'm going to edit the source directly. So this, for instance, here, that one determines what is my landing page. The workspace we're in now is this one, pbi-tools demo. If I go to report 1, I end up on the sales by month page. If I change this to 1 and commit that changed landing page, that goes into the dev branch. I'm going to push this up, and what we'll see in a second, going back to Azure DevOps, now I've got a pipeline running on single workspace, and from the dev branch we can see that here, and this is just kicking off. I did mention environments earlier. Here we go. We can see that here as well. So there's a dev environment, which again corresponds to the dev workspace. This is an alternative view where I can basically see what is the status of each environment and which pipelines are currently running where. If I go back to this, should hopefully get, there we go, almost done now. Cool. So that's happened. And if I now go back here and navigate to the report, I'm ending up on the second page instead of the first one because I just made that my active page. And the next thing I can do here is to merge the change I've just made in single workspace. Sorry, just double checking I'm in the correct. Yes, so that's single workspace. So I just committed to dev. We can see this is one commit ahead. I'm going to create a pull request to promote that change into staging. And I'm going to do that by putting it into the release branch. So obviously, normally we would have different people here confirming the change and approving it. For simplicity, obviously, I have to do that myself. So this has now been merged into a different branch, and we can see that kicked off another pipeline run from that branch, release 1.0. And when that's done, which hopefully won't take very long, we'll see that in the staging workspace. So the report currently lands on sales by month. And now that I've deployed, show you another way as well. If I go here, I'm basically getting the outputs from the deployment step specifically, which always gives me a direct URL, which I can just click on to get to the same report, and I can see, there we go. The change I had in dev earlier, changing the landing page, is now available in staging. So those are the two spectrums in terms of how far we can go, putting a thin report DevOps solution in place. The first one I showed was well, having source control and deployment automation, and then this one here also is using a branching model. It's using different environments. It would allow us to put approval workflows in place, and most importantly, whilst the PBIX file-based solution initially didn't actually tell us exactly what had changed, this one does. I can now go in here and actually go to this particular pipeline run, and I can see exactly what the change was in that commit. Obviously, I need to be able to interpret that, but in this particular case, it's relatively straightforward. I can see what's just moved into staging was actually the change on my active page index. So going back to the slides. Here we go. A quick overview of what pbi-tools does and how it's doing its work here. pbi-tools is a command line tool, so relatively techy for now. Very keen to give this a nice UI at some point, but just hasn't been the focus yet. And it basically thinks about Power BI development process in three main stages. Development, which happens on a desktop, and using tools like Power BI Desktop and Tabular Editor, DAX Studio, and all those things. Then we've got our source control system, GitHub, Azure DevOps, GitLab, whatever, where pbi-tools introduces a concept which I'm calling PBIX prod. So that's basically a folder view of a PBIX file, similar to what Tabular Editor does for tabular model save to folder. This is a save to folder for an entire PBIX file. So basically the model as well as the report. And then finally, with that in place, we can then think about deployment and CI/CD, where we're taking those sources and we're recompiling them back into a deployable PBIX file, or in case of models, into a BIM file, which analysis services would understand. There are two flavors of pbi-tools, pbi-tools Desktop and pbi-tools Core. And pbi-tools Desktop works in conjunction with Power BI desktop, so basically interactively used by developer. pbi-tools core doesn't have any of those dependencies. It's meant to run on a server, on a CI/CD server in particular. It also runs cross-platform. You can those pipelines we were just looking at, they would actually run on Linux just as they run on Windows. And as a command line tool, there are various actions. The three most important ones we've already seen. Extract basically gets us from a PBIX file to the PBIX project folder view, and compile gets us back to the file, and deploy actually orchestrates the deployment into particular workspaces. Now, moving away from the very simple a version we saw initially, in a proper enterprise setup, you definitely want to think about different environments. And I find it quite useful thinking about this as this kind of matrix. Basically, what are my environments conceptually? Which Git branches correspond to them? What does it mean in terms of access to the environments? Which Power BI workspaces correspond to them? And ultimately, who actually sees what's in there? So to give one example, production, main or master are traditional standards, how Git branches are called, but you could just call this production as well. This is obviously the environment which we want to guard the most. So I would think someone in a delivery manager or product owner role would basically determine what goes in here. And in terms of Power BI, we would have a team workspace as an example, particularly using a neat workspace name, if that makes sense. So no suffixes or anything like that, because we've got end users here. In the interest of time, I'm just going to move on. Now, the 4 sample repositories and pipelines I put together effectively demonstrate well, different ways of implementing those workflows. Simple LFS, which we started with before, only had files in them. LFS, I'm going to talk about in a second, is a Git module for large files, and particularly large binary files. So that is a very neat way of actually putting PBIX files under source control without all the drawbacks that come from them normally. And I could have a setup as simple as having only one branch, and whatever gets into that branch ends up getting deployed into a workspace. The repo single workspace with PBIX also contains PBIX files. However, based on the branch you're working in and committing to, the reports get deployed into different environments. So we've got that aspect here. In addition to that, the reports are actually extracted into the PBIX prod folder structure, but merely for change tracking, only so that you can actually see what's changed. This is to allow or to basically address a very common feedback I've been getting about pbi-tools extracting PBIX files, because that is not something Microsoft currently endorses officially. So, and clearly some people have some concerns here. So a very neat middle way from my point of view would be to still rely on actually having the PBIX files, so the fully supported approach, but then actually to get the benefit in terms of change tracking by extracting via PBI-tools as an add-on, if you will, without completely relying on this. Single workspace doesn't do that. It has a git ignore for PBIX files and basically only relies on sources. We've seen that before. And it is mapped to a fixed workspace. However, that workspace exists in 3 different flavors, one for each environment. And then the most sophisticated setup is where the workspace is actually determined from the folder structure, and where I can effectively map all reports for an entire tenant if I wanted to in one repo, where the target workspace name is simply derived from the folder. So those are examples publicly available. They're fully working. You can see the sources for those as well as the pipelines and the pipeline runs. Obviously, you won't be able to look into the Power BI tenant itself. Thinking about branching models and particularly mapping Git branches to environments. I've tried to visualize it a little bit here. So in a way, there's a pyramid in place in terms of where is most of the activity happening and where do we actually have the most control. So if we add a 4th virtual environment, which is basically the local workspace, someone working on their own machine, into the mix, we generally end up with 4 standard environments. My own laptop, dev, UAT, and production. We've already seen production is the one we definitely want to secure the most. So basically, as we go up the pyramid, we have a lot more control in place, and as a result of that, we get more quality out of it. As we go down the pyramid, we actually get much more activity. A lot of day-to-day work in terms of Power BI development obviously happens on a local workstation, and changes are propagated up. So developers effectively only commit into development branches, and I get my changes into production by sequentially promoting them into other environments. So one pattern which works quite well here is to have feature branches where each work item someone works on is tracked in a dedicated branch. That one is not linked to an environment. So committing any changes to a feature branch won't do anything in terms of deployment. However, developers are free to merge into a dedicated dev environment whenever they want to, which will then trigger deployment. So basically, those 2 levels down here have no controls in terms of us actually getting this quick feedback. Now, above, if you work on a release model, which is what we in my team do a lot, we would basically create a new branch for each upcoming release, where the release version or release name is in the branch name, and any work items already completed get merged into the release, so that this basically builds up in terms of having ultimately the final release in it. And that would be linked to my staging or UAT environment. So every time something new gets into the release branch, I then immediately actually get to see that in my staging environment, which is where my testers or my stakeholders can review items in terms of getting approval there. And only once we're done at this stage, things ultimately get merged into main, which, as we said before, corresponds to production. Let me just, obviously, we used up quite a bit of time earlier. I was going to do some more demos at this point, but I wonder whether we should open the floor for some questions here, just so we have an opportunity for those as well. I also realize my video wasn't on anymore. Now, since everyone is muted, maybe Prathi, you can give me some indication whether and how we're able to do questions.
So I have a few questions here. I could paste it in the chat. I was going to share my screen, but yeah, these are the two latest questions that I captured, and there are a few more questions.
Okay.
I'm going to post as well. Can you see the chat?
Yes, I can. So how do you prevent data from ending up in source control when using PBIX? Is there a reason you wouldn't put PBIX and use PBIT instead? Okay. So again, the context of this was thin reports. So by definition, we have no data in here. Deploying data sets is a whole different story, and there are also good solutions for data sets in place already, particularly around tabular editor, right? So I didn't need to, or didn't want to replicate something that's already out there. I wanted to find a solution for items we haven't solved yet. What's the relationship with Power BI's own deployment pipelines feature? Would you say it should completely replace? Well, yes. So Power BI deployment pipelines, definitely something I've looked into quite a bit. I was super excited when they were announced. I think the general consensus I'm getting from various people in the community is that this isn't an enterprise-ready feature. It's basically a very simplistic view of deployments, which works for small and medium-sized shops. From my point of view, the key thing I'm not getting from Power BI deployment pipelines is the visibility in terms of change control. And to me, that's extremely important. How else would we actually review and sign off changes? There's also, so I've definitely tried implementing deployment pipelines in my own team, and we've struggled enormously with the permission model, and ultimately even failed by giving some people access to them, even though we made them admins on workspaces as well as pipelines. So yeah, not a great fan. Right. A few more questions here. Deployment, automated tests. Well, automated tests, I don't have any right now. Again, the context here was reports. That is something I'd be very keen on looking into down the line. But it's also not quite obvious what those could look like as far as reports are concerned, right? Definitely more complicated than for models, as an example. Things I could imagine in terms of automated tests around reports would be having some policies in terms of giving visuals titles, having some policies in terms of adding certain metadata fields on each page, or ensuring that any report pushed into the repo always is reset to the default landing page. That's a problem I see a lot in production. People save a PBIX file on a random page, then commit all the way into Power BI, and then people don't actually start on the home page. So there are certainly a few ideas here, but that's something that needs to be more explored. What else do we have? Automate tests, data. Sorry, it's a bit difficult without a moderator here.
I added the comments to these. I edited the same, same thing. I've been adding there.
What are used for learning resources? Yes, that's something I've covered in my slides. So we'll get there once I go through the final bits there. In pipeline for large environments, deployment system. Would you know if there's a deployment system in the pipeline for large environments? I don't know. Is that the Microsoft pipeline? I wouldn't know. Epic tool, difficulties Power BI reports with custom visuals. No. The only thing is some custom visuals end up as pretty big blobs and binary artifacts when they contain lots of embedded JavaScript and embedded files. So it can bloat your repo, but other than that, no. Epic tool. Okay, awesome. Prati, did I miss any questions or anything you wanted to ask?
I think you covered everything. I added all those things. Let me quickly share my screen just in case if I missed anything.
Mm-hmm.
So looks like you covered everything. Yeah, these are the last question by Leon. Is there a roadmap available?
Oh yeah, I've got a slide on that. So if we don't have any more questions, I'll just go through a couple more slides, which will actually answer some of those.
Cool. I'll stop sharing.
Cool. So I'll go back to sharing my screen, which would be this one, I think. Yep. So back to the slides. Obviously, I'll share the slides later because there's definitely some information here for you to take home, if you will. So I mentioned Git LFS in passing earlier. That's a really exciting Git module, which I admittedly only learned about quite recently. Kudos to Scott, who I've certainly given the credit to here. And that is a very interesting a tool to look at in conjunction with PBIX files. As I said before, it effectively allows you to keep your binary PBIX files in source control. However, your Git hoster will then effectively store them in separate blob storage so that your source repo itself stays relatively slim. It's supported out of the box. It's actually incredibly easy to get started with it. Yeah, so I've got some notes here. There's a really very good tutorial on the Git LFS GitHub project. I'm going to skip this because obviously of timing. So the PBI-tools driven deployments are manifest based. That's quite important in terms of the DevOps concepts, because it means that my entire process is in source control, and I don't have some things in source control and others only defined in my CI/CD server. In terms of roadmap, docs is the one big thing I need to work on and want to work on moving forward. Connection swap is something which people have asked for, and it's actually quite easy to implement, where you basically say a report in a particular environment should be connected to a different data set. and that is low-hanging fruit and something I'm super excited about. Anything else here? Yes, workspace propagation. So that's the other thing which is going to come next. The demos we looked at today and the current setup basically assumed that certain workspaces were in place and had the right users and permissions set up. I would want to make the workspace setup part of the deployment process, actually. So some resources. I mean, admittedly, that looks a bit lame here, but if you go to the second link, the DevOps community resources on pbi-tools, I've collected a vast amount of good material, articles, books, recordings, tools, open source projects, all related to Power BI, source control, deployment, DevOps. And so, yeah, go to the link second, and that should help. And I'm continuously adding more resources there. Already given you the samples view. Yeah, so that really was what I wanted to show. It's an hour now. Just wanted to make 2 points. First of all, I'm recruiting a solutions architect in India. You can find details on LinkedIn if you think that might be interesting for you, or if you know someone, please pass on the note. Secondly, on Friday, so this week Friday, I'm going to do another session, hopefully without those kinds of disruptions with Reed, and we're going to do a deep dive into Power BI tools, PBI tools actually, and look at some of the technical details behind all the demos I've shown today. So it's 9 a.m. Pacific time, which is 5 p.m. In London on Friday. Yeah, that's what I wanted to capture. Again, many thanks, Prathi, James. You'll probably have a tough time editing that video later. Don't envy you there.
Yeah, definitely. And I'm really, really sorry. And thank you so much for handling it so well. It was, and thank you everyone as well. And I'm again very sorry that you all had to go through this. I was jokingly saying that in the beginning, and I was actually not really expecting one to happen on this call. Yeah, I think it's just happened because of our personal commitments. We had to let the lobby open today, and yeah. But thank you so much, James, who is actually not at all well today. He can't move, and he actually jumped on the call to sort it out. So yeah, huge thanks to James for actually jumping and to be able to sort out things so quickly. And thank you, everyone, for your patience. And thank you, Mathias, for a great session. And we will make sure we edit all the content and post the things on our YouTube very, very soon.
Fantastic. Thanks, Prathi. Thanks, James.
You.
Everyone else as well.
Yeah, I hope you all have a great afternoon.